A year and a half after the release of the Weapons Refrain, the Epic of Alexander has finally come to break the ultimate drought. As the first ultimate of Shadowbringers and the love letter to what might be the most difficult and mechanically dense raid in Final Fantasy XIV's history, it's an understatement to say that this fight had large shoes to fill. And yet, I cannot sing the praises for its design loud enough. Living Liquid is agreed to be the best first phase of the three ultimates and might be the best first phase of any fight altogether. Brute Justice and Cruise Chaser together bring 2 hectic minutes, reminiscent of the ads phase in the Unending Coil of Bahamut, another beloved phase. And Perfect Alexander, God, Perfect Alexander is such an incredible 6 minutes of the orchestral version of Moebius, the giant mecha that is Perfect Alexander himself, and the Time Gear aesthetic of the arena and Enrage, all meshing together flawlessly to create what might be one of my favorite moments in all of Final Fantasy. But unfortunately, one thing that stuck out like a sore thumb to me, and no prizes for guessing, is the true heart, the Enigma Codex, the Prog Waller, and the biggest mystery we've seen in Final Fantasy XIV rating thus far. And to be clear, I'm solely talking about the Enigma Codex. Fake calibration is an incredible mechanic. Seeing your clone run around and die to various mechanics is awesome aesthetically, strongly tying into the theme of future sight and time, and also is much more creative than the standard paradigm of the boss having a cast bar, and then suddenly a bunch of debuffs appearing on players' hotbars. But although the Enigma Codex is necessary to see and perform the mechanic, the designs can be neatly separated. The idea of following clones to track future debuffs and mechanics is distinct from the idea of needing players to go back into an old mechanic in the fight and perform it differently to find a secret buff. And thus for this video, we're going to solely be focusing on the Enigma Codex and the Golden True Heart. There isn't a lot to say about fake calibration itself other than that it's pretty awesome. To start off, let's talk about a benefit of the implementation of the Enigma Codex: community effort. It's no exaggeration to say that Ultimate Prog has become a community event. Thousands of viewers come to see what crazy things the developers have created for us, eagerly waiting for streamers to reach the next mechanic. Viewers also come together to brainstorm solutions to mechanics. Back in Ultima Weapon Ultimate, I remember viewers of Mr. Happy's stream trying to figure out how to get through La Hebrea's Doom. Hard mechanics quickly become a spectacle, and theory crafting potential solutions to mechanical walls makes progging evolve from a spectator sport into something that everybody is actively participating in. As such, before getting into the nitty-gritty of improving the Enigma Codex, I thought it would be fun to take a look back on fake calibration and how it made the community go insane.
Yes! Yes!
Holy shit! It stopped! Kill it.
It's got 4 vuln-ups, 4 invuln downs. What? It's going back to the... It fucked off.
Yes! We got the buff!
Yes!
Okay, so we don't have to kill it.
So that means the orbs can be wherever the fuck we want them to be.
Okay, good. You're fucking crying!
That's
retarded! It is retarded.
Yes, watching Twitch chat and Twitter collectively lose their minds for a day straight was a crazy fun experience. My very own raid group's Discord was flooded with messages with most of our static trying to theory craft our own solutions to fake calibration. But when we learned of the solution, the Golden True Heart, we all felt disappointed. After how amazing the fight had been so far, it felt like a slap in the face. Well, what's so wrong with this mechanic? Let's dig into that feeling a little bit. And pardon me for going on a tangent away from the Enigma Codex itself, but it's very important to have a shared background understanding on the design of raids before we continue. The most important thing to make clear in framing this discussion is that players should be viewing blind progression as what is effectively a group puzzle game with an execution element. What I mean by that is that fight designers create a puzzle for us, aka the mechanics of the fight. And as players, we have to solve that puzzle. To illustrate this, let's take a quick look at temporal stasis from Alexander Ultimate through the lines of a blind raider. In this mechanic, 2 players have to stay away from each other, 2 players have to stay next to each other, 2 players have unavoidable damage from lightning debuffs, and the final 2 players don't have any debuff. In addition, we see Brute Justice cast Flare Thrower 2 times, and Cruise Chaser cast Alpha Sword 3 times. Coming into this mechanic, every raider knows that Alpha Sword, Flare Thrower, and lightning debuffs all give vulnerability ups, meaning that players cannot take 2 instances of damage. And thus they have to ask themselves, how can we position all 8 players such that each player gets hit by only one thing? Obviously the answer isn't simple. Cruise Chaser using Alpha Sword alone is something completely new to that part of the fight, and previously Flare Thrower had a cast bar. But most, if not all raiders would notice after enough pulls that the bosses are targeting the players closest to them, which is one step closer to solving the mechanic. Observant raiders would notice that the Flare Thrower from Brute Justice phase is also baited by distance. Eventually, you'll come to the following solution, or something similar, fulfilling both distance and damage constraints. What makes this mechanic so great is that going into it, it feels like you have the pieces to solve the puzzle. That is, you know what all the debuffs do, and you understand how the debuffs from Alpha Sword and Flare Thrower work. But there's also an element of something new that players have to solve, all bundled in a combination that does not have a trivial solution. This mechanic is a great example of a puzzle that you might see in a more standard puzzle game, say Portal. First, in Chamber 10 in Portal, the game teaches you that portals carry momentum by basically forcing you to fall into a portal. Then, in Chamber 12, the game introduces the idea of replacing the top portal after falling to increase your momentum and further your launching distance. Finally, in Chamber 14, the player must use this momentum mechanic to launch onto a raised platform to grab a companion cube, which is used later in the chamber. In both examples, players are introduced to mechanics one at a time, with the small caveat that in Final Fantasy XIV, players are assumed to have that knowledge from the original Alexander raid. That is, in Alexander Ultimate, players are introduced to one new usage of an old or standard mechanic, proximity based for Alpha Sword and Flare Thrower, while in Portal, players are introduced to a new framing for their knowledge of momentum, and both cases are wrapped in larger, overall puzzles that have this new mechanic as only a piece of the puzzle that is otherwise solvable with just prior knowledge. In short, good puzzle games ramp up their mechanics, alternating between introducing new things slowly in controlled environments and testing the player through combinations of things they've learned. In some ways, you can think of puzzle games as both the lesson and the test. They teach you how their particular game's mechanics work, and then they see if you can apply your knowledge in creative ways to solve new puzzles. They then repeat this process, with the tests becoming more and more complicated as they have more taught mechanics that they can pull from. Raiding is no exception to this generalization. Although Ultimates ironically don't have this paradigm, often due to most of the teaching being done in the fight's original raid tiers, there are a few instances of this type of lesson then test style being shown prominently in the Epic of Alexander. The first case is seen fairly early on in Living Liquid, when the tornadoes do Protean Wave. In this mechanic, all 3 tornadoes spawn a telegraphed Protean Wave at the players closest to each tornado, and then shoot a second targeted Protean Wave at the closest players. This is something new, and effectively taught to the player after a single pull. Similarly, Living Liquid itself starts casting Protean Waves soon after, which has 3 successive waves. The first waves are targeted and dodgeable, the second waves target the 4 closest players, and the third waves also target the 4 closest players, with any player dying if they get hit by 2 Protean Waves. Again, understanding how this mechanic works only takes a pull or 2. Finally, Living Liquid hits you with the test. After casting Cascade a second time, he and the tornadoes both start casting Protean Wave at nearly the same time. You already know how both of these Protean Waves work, but it's up to you to figure out how you want to bait both the dodgeable AoEs and the targeted cones from both the boss and the tornadoes, such that no one takes damage twice too quickly in succession and dies. There are quite a few solutions to this mechanic, but it's your fairly standard test. You've seen all of these pieces before, but can you handle this combination? One final example I would like to illustrate is the final word in Perfect Alexander phase. That is, Perfect Alexander opens with completely new mechanics. First, he starts with the final word, spreading 4 new debuffs across the party. Then, he casts Ordained Motion or Stillness. Next, the debuff effects go off, and finally, he casts Ordained Stillness or Motion. This is important because this phase is the lesson. It's teaching you how these mechanics work. Specifically, Ordained Motion and Stillness check to make sure that you're either moving or standing at the end of the cast. And the debuffs create either charm or fear effects from other players, causing players to march towards or away from each other. At their base, these are all standard effects in raids, and most blind progression raiders can figure them out pretty quick the first time they see them. Then, in Fate Calibration Alpha and Beta, these effects go off on players without warning. There are no cast bars, but players can figure out what effects are going to happen by watching their clone during the Fate Calibration cast bar. What's most important here is that the players are taught about the visual effects of each mechanic, which is something that they probably noticed but disregarded at first. Forced Marches indicate the direction based on the visual above each player's head, and Ordained Stillness and Motion are indicated by different colored swords falling from the sky. Thus, by watching their clones, players are able to differentiate between which mechanics are happening. Fate Calibration is therefore the test. You've learned how all these new mechanics work, but can you figure out how to satisfy them while also dealing with standard old mechanics like Sacrament, Defamation, and Shared Sentence? The pattern of lesson then test is very clear here. To reel in this discussion a little, this becomes relevant to our original topic of the true heart when we start considering what makes a bad puzzle game and what makes a hard puzzle game. It's very obvious that if raiding is a puzzle game, then ultimate raiding is a hard puzzle game. After all, it's ultimate difficulty, and it's made to appease the most hardcore of raiders. But it's very easy to make a difficult puzzle game. The hardest puzzle I know is, what number am I thinking of? And yet, it's unfun, and some might even say it's basically not a puzzle. A hard puzzle game isn't just a difficult question. It has to be something carefully constructed with logical pieces for the player to experiment with such that they can eventually find the right combination, kind of like a large jigsaw puzzle. And it can't simply teach you everything right off the bat either, or else the game would be too easy and solving the puzzle would not be satisfying, like putting together a 25-piece jigsaw puzzle for most adults. One example of puzzle difficulty done right, in my opinion, is again Protean Wave in Living Liquid. I did not mention it earlier for simplicity's sake, but in the second and third waves of the boss's Protean Wave, he also shoots a cone out in front of him no matter what. This is completely new. In the original Alexander's iteration of Protean Wave, the waves simply targeted random players. Thus, it was difficult to notice, and for most blind raiders, we simply saw that our main tank would die randomly, even though it looked like they were doing the mechanic correctly. But on careful inspection, one would notice that even if no one is in front, like after the main tank dies, the boss shoots a wave forward, and the player can then solve how the mechanic works. It's not immediately obvious, but with a sharp eye and a bit of deduction, it isn't too difficult to figure out this new mechanic and create a solution to Protean Wave with it in mind. So that's one mechanic that is a bit more obscure or hard to understand. But why is that okay in my mind or my raid members' minds, whereas the Enigma Codex is not? In the end, this is a judgment of degree. We draw the line of a mechanic being too obscure or hard to solve somewhere between Protean Wave and the Golden True Heart. But that's not really a satisfactory answer to this question. After all, we haven't even talked about how the Enigma Codex was solved, or how the mechanic even works. And if we could just leave it at that, there would be no reason to even have this video. So to go a bit more in depth, let's analyze the details of the Golden True Heart, and contrast them with the other prominent hidden mechanic from an ultimate fight, the Woke Primals in Ultima Weapon Ultimate. To start off, I'm going to briefly describe how the Enigma Codex and how the Woke Primals work. If you are familiar with these mechanics, you can go ahead and skip to the next section of the video. Starting with Alexander Ultimate, in the final Perfect Alexander phase, Alexander eventually casts an ability called Fate Projection Alpha, followed by an extremely long cast bar in Fate Calibration Alpha. After completing the cast bar, 4 clones of Alexander spawn and they instantly fire off Ordained Motion or Stillness, then Shared Sentence, Aggravated Assaults, and Sacraments at the same time without any warning. The key here is that if your character has the Enigma Codex buff during the Fate Calibration Alpha cast bar, a bunch of clones of players and all the Alex clones will spawn early, and the clones will die to all the mechanics that you will get. Effectively, you are seeing the future, so even though none of the mechanics have cast bars, you see all the effects that happen beforehand. However, obtaining the Enigma Codex, the topic of this video, was not simple to figure out. In Inception Formation, a whole 5 minutes earlier in the fight, the initial strategy was to drop the crystals in the intercardinal positions and the plasma orbs down the middle, to slow down and allow the party the time to kill the heart. It turns out, by letting the heart run straight through 4 crystals, the heart turns golden, giving the whole party the Enigma Codex buff, and replaces the functionality of the crystal by telling you where Alexander is teleporting. All of these changes are important, as I will explain later when discussing the Enigma Codex. Moving on to Woke, after killing the 3 Primals for the first time, the party is greeted with 6 Magitech bits in a large circle that quickly enrage. It's pretty obvious that the only way to kill them is to cast your LB3, but after killing them, La Brea appears and inflicts the whole party with doom. Parties wiped to this for a while, not being able to figure out how to cleanse the doom. Eventually, parties figured out that you could wake the Primals. A woken Primal drops a buff that refreshes your LB3, so after using the caster LB3, the party gets an LB3 refunded, and the healer can LB3, which cleanses the doom. This is followed by a melee LB3 and a tank LB3, so the party needs to wake all 3 Primals. To wake the Primals, you have to make them get 4 stacks of etherically charged, and the method of gaining a stack depends on the Primal, but generally involves doing a given mechanic in a more difficult way. Garuda requires the players to cleanse 2 stacks of thermal low, which deals much heavier damage to the party than if you cleanse 1 stack. Ifrit requires you to hit his nails with 2 eruptions each, which makes them do more damage and take less damage. Finally, Titan requires you to chain jail explosions from the back to the front of the arena. If Titan stands in the puddle of a jail explosion, he gains etherically charged stacks. Comparing these 2 mechanics, one of the key differences that makes Woke okay in my mind, and the Enigma Codex not, is the buff that is supposed to be a hint towards solving the mechanic. In Ultimate Weapon, if you accidentally cleanse 2 thermal low stacks or hit a nail with 2 eruptions, you can see the boss get an etherically charged buff, something that's completely new and mysterious. This buff doesn't seem to do anything on its own. If you're perceptive, you will notice this early on in Prague, and when your group gets walled at La Brea's doom, it's not hard to put 2 and 2 together and hypothesize that etherically charged, the one buff that hasn't done much yet, is probably related to this wall. On the other hand, if you hit the heart in Alexander Ultimate with a crystal, it gains 1 stack of vulnerability down. Since at that point in Prague, not killing the heart means that it flies into Alexander Prime and gives him a massive damage up. This vulnerability down buff is clearly a bad thing. Logically, you would believe that if the heart hits all 4 crystals, it will get 4 vulnerability down debuffs and effectively become invincible. There are also other complications that make players feel discouraged from letting the crystals blow up. Crystals are necessary to notify the players where Alexander teleports after inception, so even if you, for some reason, had to have the heart blow up all 4 crystals, it would seem that doing the following mechanics is impossible. This means that you would try to avoid this at all costs, unless it was your last-ditch effort, which funnily enough was how the mechanic was solved in the first place. This is a strong contrast with the etherically charged buff, which seemingly does nothing, so it's a safe avenue to experiment with. Another important difference between the 2 mechanics is that it's much easier to stumble upon etherically charged. Etherically charged stacks come exclusively from new mechanics. Garuda's thermal low stacks are new, Eruption buffing nails is new, and Jail's triggering chain explosions is new. Thus, players are much more likely to mess up this mechanic and accidentally give the boss a stack of etherically charged. On the other hand, good players know how Inception works, so there's a high chance that they will place the crystals intercardinal the first time they see the mechanic, and almost never place a crystal in the path of the heart. Therefore, it's only by making a major mistake or doing crazy experimentation that blind proggers would even see the heart can trigger crystal explosions in the first place. There are also many opportunities to see etherically charged pop up. Each of the 3 primals has its own method after all, compared to only being able to see the crystal explosions affect the heart during that short 15-second period in Inception formation. Overall, the progression to find the woke status has many more hints nudging you towards the right answer, whereas finding the Enigma Codex from the true heart feels unintuitive and sometimes completely antithetical to standard mechanic solving. One other important quality of Ultimate Weapon is that the Doom mechanic is much more of an obvious wall than Fate Calibration Alpha. When the whole party is afflicted with Doom, the first thought is that the party needs to reach full health, which is a common method to cleanse Doom. After testing and seeing that this doesn't work, it's fairly clear to the party that they have to go back and do something else differently. This is because nothing else is happening when the Doom comes out, so there's not a lot of other things you can try other than going back to previous phases. On the other hand, Fate Calibration seems almost solvable. After all, what if there's some sort of pattern that determines which mechanics happen? That's not too out of the ordinary. It wouldn't be very surprising if the furthest player got Share Sentence, the closest player got Defamation, and so on. There were even a few patterns in the mechanics. For example, it was always one of the middle 2 clones that didn't use Sacrament, so maybe there was something more there. This meant as a blind raider, you wouldn't fully be convinced that you have to go back and experiment with older parts of the fight. The only potential hint you really have at that point is that both Brute Justice and Cruise Chaser have an Enigma Codex buff on them when you kill them before Alexander casts his ultimate, but this is almost more confusing than it is helpful. While it does alert you to the fact that this buff exists, you might infer that the buffs are somehow related to those bosses, and that you have to do something special in killing them to receive the buff yourself, which is a massive red herring. In summary, finding the true heart feels illogical, and there weren't any hints laid out towards deducing that the heart needs to run through 4 crystals, which is problematic under the premise that puzzle games and rating should lay out all of the pieces for players to solve and subtly nudge them towards the right answer. On the other hand, the woke mechanic offered many more opportunities for players to solve it and provide clear direction for what different things progress might try next, which created a unique and now loved experience, even though it was a bit difficult to solve at first. As with my other videos, I want to talk about solutions. It's easy to complain about this mechanic, but I would like to go over some quick ideas that could make the Enigma Codex just as good as the woke mechanic. The first potential solution I have here is fairly straightforward. Change the buff that the heart gets when it runs through Inception crystals. By introducing a new buff, the players will immediately be curious when they see it for the first time, and decide that it's an important avenue of exploration. You could even use a standard vulnerability up debuff, since the players would immediately want to get 4 stacks of that to aid with the DPS check. With this change, finding the true heart becomes a bit easier, especially if you note that you only need 3 crystals to satisfy Inception, meaning that progress experimenting with different phases of the fight are likely to try to eventually drop the extra crystals in random spots to see what happens. Another solution is to not give the Enigma Codex buff to Brute Justice and Cruise Chaser during the DPS burn near the end of the fight. As I mentioned before, this is misleading, and led to stuff like Arthur's group trying to kill both the bosses at the same time, since it's only natural to believe that the buff is somehow related to these bosses. However, the buff definitely should exist somewhere in the fight, since it's the only hint that there exists something else that might be used to solve Fate Calibration Alpha. One quick fix here is to give the heart the Enigma Codex buff instead. However, I think this would be a little too easy. The second any group walls at Fate Calibration, they will immediately experiment with the heart, and given that there's very few things you can do with the heart during Inception formation, it wouldn't take very long for groups to figure it out at all. It wouldn't really fulfill that head-scratching puzzle-like element that the dev team seems to be going for, so this isn't the best solution. Another angle is to give Alexander Prime the Enigma Codex buff if the heart reaches the boss. This is something that players would only see if they mess up the heart or are already experimenting with it, but it is still a hint that the raiders should do something different with the heart. Technically, before Alexander Ultimate, we have never seen what happens when the heart touches Alexander Prime, only when it touches quick things, so this line of experimentation isn't out of the question either. Admittedly, this is still a bit too easy and direct for what is supposed to be a puzzling mechanic, but it's still better than having a red herring of putting the buff on both Brute Justice and Cruise Chaser. These are only 2 small changes that I came up with, but I'm sure there are many more out there that can rectify the main issues I highlighted previously. Finally, before we wrap up, I would like to talk for a minute about a few miscellaneous things with the Enigma Codex. The first is the mechanic in relation to the world race. Although it definitely was not an issue this tier, mechanic design like the Enigma Codex can be overly centralizing in determining the results of the world race. Team A could be ahead of Team B in the race, but if both teams get walled at complex, unintuitive mechanics, the playing ground is now equal. In the case like Enigma Codex, where the solution feels almost random and requires guessing, Team B might get lucky and guess the right solution first, and then pull ahead and win the race. In cases like this, it's not unreasonable to say that one single mechanic is over-centralizing in determining the results of the race. Now, you might say that being able to solve mechanics like these is a part of your skill that is being tested in the world race, and to an extent I would agree. But the problem is that it has the potential to overshadow all the other important skills in raiding, such as consistency and ability to quickly learn strategies. Again, this was definitely not a problem in the race for Alexander Ultimate. Thoughts Per Second is an incredible team that progressed extremely quickly before even hitting the Fate Calibration wall, but I'd be worried for the future if they continue to implement mechanics like these, especially if they show up so late in the fight. The next is how mechanics like these interact with data mining, and again I want to make this clear. I'm not saying Thoughts Per Second use data mining or anything to get ahead. I'm strictly talking about the potential of these effects. But the race for Alexander Ultimate could have been strongly affected by data mining. That is, data mines showed that there was a new Golden Heart model, and it also showed that one version of the Enigma Codex buff applied Transfiguration. Putting 2 and 2 together, it's not hard to infer that the normal heart might somehow get the Enigma Codex and transform into the Golden Heart. With that knowledge in mind, racing teams would have a much easier time figuring out that they had to mess around with the heart, giving them a strong advantage over teams that didn't data mine. In the case of Alexander specifically, I don't think anyone noticed or used this to their advantage, but it's something obvious in retrospect and, again, makes me worried for weird mechanic design in the future. Designing around data mining is not easy by any means, but at the very least, stuff like Woke only told you that there was a buff available later in the fight, and that the bosses could get stacks of some new weird buff somehow, something that players probably noticed when going in blind anyway, since it was very easy to accidentally give Garuda stacks at first. The potential for advantage in Ultima Weapon Ultimate felt a lot smaller than it was for Alexander Ultimate. Finally, I want to briefly acknowledge the so-called lore solution to the True Heart. For those who are not familiar with Alexander's story, the Enigma Codex was what Quick Think's All Thoughts used to control Alexander, and the heart mechanic is from his fight in the original Alexander raid tiers. However, this tie is tenuous at best. For one, using lore for mechanics is a bit questionable in my opinion. While lore can legitimately be part of a puzzle, this is something that no one expected and something that we have never seen before. When thinking about the hints given to us by developers to solve the puzzle, there is an implicit assumption that everything needs to exist within the fight. While it wouldn't be a problem for that paradigm to change, it would need to be clear in the future, with a pattern of multiple fights referencing things outside the encounters themselves, and only then will players start to realize and reframe how they solve puzzles. I would compare this new approach to mechanics to solving a jigsaw puzzle, only to be told that you actually have to bend a piece in half for it to be completed. When you approach the puzzle, there are implicit assumptions around the fact that the puzzle provides you with the exact number of pieces and that they all fit together via the knobs to form a complete picture. To go outside of this assumption would be confusing at first. Of course, after solving a few of these puzzles involving piece bending, it wouldn't be hard to keep new assumptions in mind and probably would be as easy as solving normal puzzles. But that differential needs to be applied carefully, deliberately, and consistently. One final note, I think lore as an assist to solving the puzzle is awesome. If the Enigma Codex was more readily solvable, it would feel like a nice nod to those who know the story, a fun reference that gives the fight a bit more flavor. But it shouldn't ever be considered a main hint towards figuring out how a mechanic might work, at least not with how fights are currently designed. So in summary, Alexander Ultimate is a great fight, with key examples of lesson than test mechanic design, but the obscurity of the Enigma Codex makes me feel like that the mechanic in particular should have been iterated on more in development. Its closest direct comparison, the Woke mechanic, has more hints towards the solution, whereas solving Enigma Codex almost feels like blindly stabbing in the dark. But I want to know, what did you all think of the Enigma Codex and more generally, the Epic of Alexander? Do you think that the Golden True Heart was well designed? How does Alexander stack up against the other Ultimates? Do you have a suggestion on what to do a video on next? Whatever your thoughts are, I would love to hear them in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to this channel or follow myself or Matai at our social media links on screen. Thanks for watching everyone.